Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conference. This is our first IET national conference specific to electrotechnical and building services competence. The main focus of this conference is recognizing individual competence and driving up professionalism within the electrotechnical and building services sectors. Let me just say that at one stage, I wondered if I would ever be able to say these words. We first started talking about this conference in the summer of 2019. And with COVID, isolation, non-isolation, on, off, this conference has been scheduled and cancelled, or postponed at least, more than 5 times. But delighted that finally we've got to it. In saying that, I want to pay tribute to the resilience and determination of the IET team, who have been frustrated at every turn, but continued with the belief that this is worth doing. I'd also like to acknowledge the commitment of the speakers who have loyally stayed with us throughout all the chopping and changing. I think we will probably find that what they say today is rather different from what they would have said 18 months ago, which may well be an inadvertent benefit. The IET is a professional body committed to driving compliance, ethics, professional standards, and sharing best practice for those working in engineering and technology. Key to this compliance, which ensures our members are compliant with the IET's professional code of conduct and ethical practice. As a chartered engineer myself, I understand the relevance of monitoring individual competence and undertaking continual professional development. I applaud the many employers who consistently support the professional development of their technical staff and work with the IET and other professional bodies to strive for professional standards. Today, we will hear from speakers on a range of related topics. Driving commitment to doing what is right and keeping people safe is absolutely essential, especially for those working in safety critical roles. There will be the opportunity for questions and comments, and it is important that we hear your views and comments throughout the conference. Collectively, we can work together to drive change where this is needed. Competence starts with a good grounding and start in an individual's career. And here I must emphasize and support apprenticeships as the ideal start. The IET, along with employers, has been involved in the development of the current standard-based apprenticeship, often described as the Trailblazer. The apprenticeship has been in place now for some 7 years and is coming up for review, which will give an opportunity to update the standard, and many of you will be involved in that. Whilst the apprenticeship is a good start, we will hear today about the need to keep skills current through continual professional development, CPD. Membership of the institution and recognition as EdgeTech provides a framework and recognition of this continuing commitment to skills.
So just to recap,
it's an approach I would thoroughly recommend.
So 4 years ago,
I'm delighted this afternoon to be joined by a range of great speakers who will take us through aspects relating to this topic. Today, we will take an overview of the issues, with the second part of this conference in February hearing directly from employers. When we originally considered this conference, it was going to be a one-day face-to-face conference. Clearly, a whole day online is very difficult to keep people's interest. And so we've split it in two. As I've mentioned before, first part today, second part in February. Can I encourage you to post questions via the chat function online to us throughout the conference? There will be question and answer panel sessions, and we welcome comments, questions, and thoughts. Our speakers will answer as many of your questions as they can in the time that we have today. Talking through the agenda briefly, I will hand over shortly to IET's President, Sir Julian Young, who will provide you with an introduction to the IET. We will then hear from our opening keynote speaker, Dame Judith Hacket, followed by Alistair Coates, who is the Chief Exec of the Engineering Council. We'll take questions and comments from the three speakers after their presentations. This will be followed by my colleague Graham Kenyon hosting a discussion panel focusing on safety with Charlie Pugsley from the London Fire Brigade and Chris Norris from the National Residential Landlords Association. Further Q&A will follow this panel, giving the opportunity to raise points and ask questions. As a reminder, let me just say again, please use the chat function to send over questions and issues. We aim to finish around 4 o'clock this afternoon, allowing time just before to recap and provide you with some information regarding what to expect from part 2 on the 21st of February. It's my pleasure now to introduce the first speaker of the afternoon, Sir Julian Young, who took up the role of IET President last year. Sir Julian retired recently from the Royal Air Force after 40 years of service as an engineer officer. In his last post, he was Director General Air within the Defence and Equipment Support Organisation in the Ministry of Defence. Sir Julian will discuss the importance of professionalism, ethics and competence. Sir Julian, over to you.
Keith, thanks very much indeed. Well, hello everyone. I'm Julian Young, and in fact, I'm very proud to be the 140th President of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. In fact, it's my greatest pleasure to join you today at this Electrotechnical and Building Safety National Conference. At the IET, we are a diverse home for engineering and technology throughout the world. With more than 158,000 members in over 150 countries, we are truly an international organisation. Our mission of working to engineer a better world is at the heart of everything we do. We offer support to individuals from a range of engineering disciplines, sectors, and interests, from those developing skills in new engineering capabilities to those who are perfecting their established skills. As a multidisciplinary institution, we reflect the increasingly diverse nature of engineering in the 21st century. And of course, we have a strong pedigree in electrical and electronic engineering. The breadth and depth of what we do means we're uniquely placed to help and support wider society, which sits at the heart of our purpose as a not-for-profit organisation. Through our mission to inspire, inform, and influence, we position ourselves as a trusted engineering institution with valuable insights on the most important topics and societal challenges. Now, the IET has been delivering national electrical standards for many years, dating indeed back to 1882, when the first edition of the IET wiring regulations, rules and regulations for the prevention of fire risks arising from electrical lighting, was produced by the Society of Engineers and of Electricians, or as was then. The purpose of the wiring regulations was to prevent fires that were caused by electrical lighting, a problem which was prolific during this time as people began to use this new form of energy and lighting. These were later extended to all aspects of electrical wiring, including factories and ships. Since then, we have seen a dramatic change in the way we use electricity, especially in the last 30 years or so, and therefore the regulations we must abide by in order to keep ourselves and society safe reflect just this. More commonly known in our industry as British Standard 7671, the IET wiring regulations is now in its 18th edition and continues to provide a framework for the electrical industry in the United Kingdom, and has also been adopted by many countries in other parts of the world, with also the UK and European countries having aligned with the CENELEC standards. Now, professional registration is an important milestone for any engineer or technician. It demonstrates professionalism, competence, and personal commitment to the engineering and technology sectors within the energy sector. We encourage all of our members to adhere to knowledge, network, and rules of conduct, which provide guidance and informational sources to support our members to take such decisions, and of course, always to act ethically for the good of public support and service. For us in the IET, CPD, that's continual professional development, you all know that very well, is important so that our members remain informed and in touch with the latest developments within their industry and therefore remain relevant. CPD helps to help people, you, keep up to date with current practice and standards, as well as continuing to grow your knowledge and skill set throughout your career. Plus, CPD is important for everyone. It helps you demonstrate your commitment to your profession, get recognition, and provide evidence of competence. It's not just about your own development, however. It's also about using your expertise to mentor and support those who are just starting out in their careers or are looking to achieve professional registration. It's about making a positive impact on the next generation, whether that's new apprentices or undergraduates or new graduates or new people to the industry. Who knows, you may even inspire them to look into further apprenticeships, where the IET has its Electrotechnical Trailblazer apprenticeship standards for budding electrical engineers. Membership, especially for the RAF and Armed Forces, is therefore becoming part of the IET. It's a fantastic way to share and develop their knowledge whilst encouraging individuals outside the engineering and technology community into the industry. We have members all around the world, many who have helped us in our mission to inspire, inform and influence, not only the engineering community, but wider society. Being part of the IET offers you support from like-minded people, as well as the chance to learn from others and find new opportunities. Looking to my own background of 40 years of engineering in the Royal Air Force, I developed a passion for personal and professional development, especially when it helped servicemen and women to make the transition from the armed forces to use their skills in the civilian sector. The RAF is a technology-based service, unsurprisingly heavily regulated from a safety perspective, and some 38% of its people are engineers and technicians. The large majority of this workforce are technicians, which I think mirrors most other large engineering organisations across the United Kingdom. Thus, with an average 8% turnover, there are hundreds of people leaving the RAF each year and the other military services. And increasingly, our technicians are gaining professional registration so that their skills can be more easily understood and appreciated by future civilian employers. And turning to the topic of today's conference, many of these are qualified and experienced electrical and avionics technicians. And so it's exciting to see where electrical engineering will take us as we see even more incredible advancements with regard to future technology. As the IET, we are ensuring that alongside this, the safety and professionalism of our engineers and technicians, as well as our society, is first and foremost. I trust you will all find both parts 1 and 2 of this conference of great interest and of corporate and personal value. Thank you very much indeed for having me today. Keith, back to you.
So Julian, thank you very much indeed for that input and giving us a good grounding as we move forward to hear from other people. Our next speaker, one hesitates to say, needs no introduction, but to the audience at this conference, she will be very well known. Dame Judith Hacket.
Good morning.
Was appointed as chair of Make UK in April 16 and chair of the HSE from October 7 to March 2016. Dame Judith is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and is currently a member of the Board of Trustees. She's also a fellow of the Institution of Chemical Engineers. But more recently and significantly for us, in August 2017, Dame Judith was asked by DCLG to chair an independent review of building regulations and fire safety following the Grenfell tragedy. Her final report was published in May 2018. Dame Judith, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you very much to IET for inviting me to speak as part of this event. I'm going to talk this morning about my independent review and, more importantly, the lessons that were learned from that review and how those are being taken forward. This really is a story about the need to change the culture of the whole of the construction industry. So just to recap on what has happened. So 4 years ago, I was invited by the Secretary of State in the wake of the Grenfell Tower disaster to undertake an independent review. We need to be very clear that this independent review that I conducted is not the same as the public inquiry, which continues, but my review was looking specifically at the regulatory framework, the regulatory system. I published my report in 2018. Since then, we've established an industry safety steering group, which is very much about trying to change the culture of the industry. But we have also seen a number of developments, not least of which is the establishment of two new regulatory bodies, the Building Safety Regulator and the Construction Products Regulator. And the bill is making its way through the various parliamentary processes and will be introduced into law in 2023. That doesn't mean you've got a year before you start making changes, because the government is very clear that the responsibility for shortcomings lies with those who fail to build buildings of the right quality in the first place. But 4 years is a long time, and many other things have happened in the meantime. Brexit, of course, COVID, which is still with us, a massively increased awareness of climate change and its impacts. And of course, that has big impacts on how we are going to need to build buildings in the future. But also, we've become very much more acutely aware of supply shortages, particularly in construction, and also shortages of skills. As all of these new issues come to the fore, it's quite easy, I think, to let things that have happened some time ago become less important. But in the case of building safety and quality, we cannot do that. The quality of the buildings that we have built in the UK in the last 20 or so years, particularly high-rise, is nothing short of a national scandal, and we need to make a change for the good and for the long term. So let's just quickly look at some of the problems that we have in the system. It was so quick after the Grenfell Tower fire that people pointed very specifically at cladding as being the only problem, the key problem. I would not disagree that cladding was part of the problem, but what my diagnosis showed was that this problem was much bigger, more deep-seated. Many of you will be familiar with the contents of my report, and it's not my intention to run through all of these as part of this presentation. But what I would do, and what I do want to do, is to just point out some of the ones that I think are key for this discussion today. What I saw and what I found when I looked at the system was characterized and has been quoted many times since my report as a race to the bottom, where there's clear evidence of people gaming the system. What do I mean by that? People playing with the rules and saying, if the rules don't say I can't, then I will assume that I can get away with whatever poor practice that is. You only have to look at the public inquiry to see evidence of that still coming to the fore even today. Very clear to me that this was a problem that was much more widespread than simply in high-rise buildings. So the culture of the whole construction and built environment industry needs to change. And one of the very specific recommendations and findings of my report was around this area of competence and quality assurance throughout the sector. And this is a thread that we will return to as part of this presentation, because it is increasingly of importance. And I want to talk also about what competence looks like, because it's not strictly defined by your own discipline. So if those were the problems that we found, what needs to be put in place? A very different system going forward. Our new regulatory system needs to recognize both that regulation itself is a system and how it works in practice really matters, but also that the buildings themselves are complex systems. At the moment, we have a very fragmented way of looking at buildings in terms of the walls, the electrics, the foundations, and seeing all of those things as being separate, when in fact, the building itself is what matters, and that is a system that has to work in totality. That is where this need for competence, accountability, and responsibility comes from. It is not good enough for people simply to say, my bit's okay, it's the other people who got it wrong, not me. We need to start getting people to work together, to collaborate, and recognize that it's the overall outcome that matters. I know that this is a big culture change for the industry, and it needs to be underpinned by positive incentives for those who are willing to stand up and do the right thing, but also much more significant sanctions for those who continue to try and game the system and get away with whatever they can. It also needs to be risk-based and proportionate. We cannot apply the same stringent regulatory regime to simple houses and small buildings that we will to complex high-rise buildings. It needs to be proportionate to the size of the risk. But overall, whatever the size or complexity of buildings, our focus needs to be on delivering quality buildings which are safe and which people feel safe to live in. And that is something I will return to again, because one of the things that has been lost in the last 4 years has been that trust in this sector, where people no longer do feel they can trust those who they thought were committed to providing safe homes for them. As I said, this is more than just about safety. For me, this is an issue that links quality, sustainability, and resilience. If we are going to build homes that are fit for purpose and which people feel safe to live in, that means they not only have to be meet all of the regulations, but they have to be visibly of a better quality. They have to address issues of sustainability. And certainly we have to move away from this notion that let's hope that things don't happen. Let's hope that the fire doesn't happen. Let's hope that people can get out. We have to have resilient strategies that we can demonstrate and build confidence that those things will be true. So what progress have we made in driving this culture change? I mentioned in my first slide that we have set up an industry safety steering group, and we have recently published our 3rd annual report on what we see in terms of progress. The answer is a mixed picture. There are a large number of people throughout the built environment sector in all parts who have seen the need for change and are making good progress. The problem is that too many are continuing to wait to be told what to do, or using the excuse, and it is an excuse, that they can't move until they know what the detail is. The detail doesn't matter. The message is very simple. build homes that are safe, build homes that are of the right quality, or very simply, build homes that you personally would be happy to live in or have members of your family live in. One of the most important activities that has taken place over the last 4 years is the emergence of the Building a Safer Future Charter. I think this is a really important development and one which is gaining pace all of the time, where people can voluntarily commit to be part of that process and to demonstrate that they are doing the right thing. It is my view that Building a Safer Future Charter will become more and more important as people start to demand proof that companies and organizations are committed to that and are demonstrating their commitment to doing the right thing. As I said before, professional competence is fundamental. And that means knowing more than just your own job and trade. It means understanding how your role and your activity impacts upon the system integrity and how you can, both by getting it right, preserve that integrity, or if the job is done poorly, or you observe something that someone else is doing that is not in keeping with that system integrity, that you know what to do and how to do it, because it is part of your responsibility as a professional, not just to do the job yourself right, but to ensure that others are doing the same. This is a complex issue because we are intervening in a system that is broken. So that leads to two different challenges going forward. One of those, of course, is getting it right for the future, which is about new build. This is about modernizing the approach of the industry, getting the right procedures and processes in place that will provide assurance and proof of quality, because that will be required by clients. If we are going to continue to talk about value engineering in future, that needs not to be about cost and corner cutting, but really needs to be about delivering quality for value. But also we need to recognize that this is a massive opportunity to turn things around and to leave that race to the bottom behind and emerge with a very different looking industry practice that will rebuild trust and competence. I really do welcome IET's leadership in this area, but we really do need to step up and get people to take action now rather than waiting for the regulation to come into force. Existing building stock, of course, is a more complex issue. How do you go back and address problems that are already embedded in existing buildings? Not least the challenge of who pays for that. And I'm very pleased that the government has recognised that it cannot be for residents, whether they be renting or leaseholders, to pay for the work of those who failed to provide them with good quality homes in the first place. But having said that, given that high-rise, high-risk buildings will come, that already exist, will be within scope of the new regulatory regime, it's really important that we address the improvements and remediation work that is needed, that we get on with it. It's taken far too long to get to this point, but that needs to be done in a proportionate way. I've already said it's really important that we address this issue proportionately rather than trying to eliminate all risk, because clearly no building can be guaranteed as absolutely safe, but we do have to arrive at a position where those buildings are safe enough for us to ensure that people will be safe to live there. That's what rebuilding confidence and trust is all about, as well as engaging with the residents, not simply leaving them in the lurch, wondering what is happening and living in fear, both of the cost to them, which thankfully appears to be receding, but also they need to understand what is appropriate for their building. And even when we fix the problems of the past, we have to continue to manage any changes to those buildings throughout the life cycle as we go forward. Because for me, it doesn't matter what the height of the building is. What matters is that everyone should be able to feel safe in their home. That is everyone's right, irrespective of the type of dwelling that they live in. And that's why we need to have this risk-based approach, and why competence and quality assurance must become part of the new culture across the whole of construction, not just in those areas of higher risk associated with higher and complex buildings, but across the whole of the industry. So let's be clear. Change is going to be required no matter what, because the new regulatory regime is going to come into force in 2023. But what continues to baffle me is why people sit on the fence and wait to be told what to do next. It doesn't make any sense. There is pressure on industry to do more, and leaders need to act now to show what they can do and to rebuild that confidence in the reputation of the whole sector. That's going to require independent accreditation, independent review and assurance, and that should not be something that people are afraid of. Being able to show your credentials, being able to show that you are competent and that your behavior is ethical and in line with the spirit of the regulation is hugely important. So my closing message to all of you would be to make the most of this opportunity within the sector and more broadly by standing up now and being counted for doing the right thing. Thank you very much.
Dame Judith, thank you very much for that presentation. You raise a number of important and in many ways quite concerning issues. And we need to go on and consider how we can address these. Let me just quickly remind everybody that the opportunity is there for questions and put them up on the chat. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Alistair Coates, who is Chief Executive of the Engineering Council. Alistair has more than 40 years experience in infrastructure, in both water and transportation projects. He began his role with the Engineering Council in March 2017, having been a chartered engineer with the Engineering Council for over 35 years. He's a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, a member of the Chartered Institute of Highways Transportation, and a chartered member of the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. Alistair will take us through the role of the regulator and the standards and contextualization for high-rise buildings, plus the recognised electrician EdgeTech standard. Alistair, thank you very much indeed.
Hello, my name is Alistair Coates. I'm the CEO of the Engineering Council. And I'm delighted to join you today at the IET National Conference. And today I will be concentrating upon regulating the engineering profession. So I'm going to cover three topical themes: the role of the regulator, standards and contextualization with regards to high-rise buildings, and the recognised electrician EdgeTech standard as a national benchmark of competence for electricians. So, the role of the regulator. Well, the Engineering Council is the UK regulatory body for the engineering profession, and we operate under a Royal Charter. We set and maintain internationally recognised standards for professional competence and commitment, and we award the titles of EdgeTech, iEng, CEng, and ICT Tech. We license some 39 professional engineering institutions and are associated with 17 professional affiliates. With some 230,000 registrants worldwide, 19% of our titles are held internationally and around 7% are held by women. So by holding the National Register for Engineers, this provides recognition through membership of a PEI, and also that individual's competence has been assessed. It's open to any practicing engineers or technicians, with different pathways available to registration. Being on the register demonstrates commitment to continuing professional development, a very big and important underpinning of professional activity. So as you can see from this slide, there's just about every engineering discipline represented by all 39 professional engineering institutions. This is a broad family and allows for specialization such as fire, explosives or agriculture, as well as the broader civil, mechanical, electrical engineering activities. So to become a registrant of the Engineering Council and join the National Register, you must be a member of a professional engineering institution. And by peer review, that institution who we license will review and then admit you to our register. This allows designated letters to be used, such as iEng or CEng. To help, we publish many of our standards and all of our standards and guidance on our website. They're available by going onto our website. Standards include UK Spec. This is the UK standard for professional engineering competence and commitment. Another important standard is what is referred to as AHEB, the Accreditation of Higher Education Programs. We also have the Approval of Qualifications and Apprenticeships standard, and also Information and Communications Apprenticeships, ICT Tech standard. So that demonstrates and forms the various standards that we require potential registrants to achieve. We also have guidance, and currently we have 5 key guidance documents: risk, sustainability, whistleblowing, security, and ethical principles. Finally, just to mention our pocketbook, and this is a pocketbook guide to registration. It's often referred to as the pink book. That details all the PEIs, showing their compositions, their activities, and their membership profile. So in terms of UK Spec that I mentioned, this is one of our key documents, and it's focused around competency and commitment, and it's the cornerstone of registration, and it's also the cornerstone of some of the work we've been doing on the building safety and contextualized registers activities. So the UK Spec importantly covers skills and experience, knowledge and understanding, and the attitude. By attitude, we have referred to values and behaviours that are expected and to be able to be demonstrated. So just moving on in terms of the UK Spec and how that has been used to help with standards and contextualizations with regards to high-rise buildings. This is an important area. The Competence Steering Group published its final report in October 2020, setting the bar, and that was building on the 2018 Dame Judith Hackett's report, Building a Safer Future, all as a response and a consequence of the Grenfell fire. Within that, there are 13 key working groups reporting to the Competence Steering Group, bringing together many bodies from across the building sector, enabling it to form a comprehensive view and ensure significant buy-in to the recommendations. Our work at the Engineering Council has concentrated upon the Competence Working Group 1, titled Engineers. This is chaired by the Engineering Council board member, George Adams, and staff support led by Katie Turf from the Engineering Council. Its scope was to develop the competency required by engineering professionals engaged in design, build, testing and maintenance. The working group looked at recommendations based around the appointment of a lead engineer, the adoption of a user-friendly safety management system, and piloting that with industry professionals, and finally the development of a contextualized high-rise building register, which is underpinned by a code of ethics and professional engineering conduct. Engineering Council are undertaking this contextualized register project and is looking at the third bullet point on the slide here. This project is focusing on how we move from a concept to implementation. So in terms of contextualized registration, we wanted to set down some key assumptions. And those assumptions were that it would be based on our contextualized version of UK Spec that I referred to a little earlier. But it embeds the British standards overarching frameworks for competence. Individuals will be assessed by the PEIs, and individuals will be identified as a searchable section of the Engineering Council Register database. There'll be a requirement for periodic revalidation of the prescribed competence levels. It will be licensed and quality assured by the Engineering Council, and opportunities for PEIs to collaborate to develop and deliver their engineering building safety training and CPD programs will be encouraged and promoted. So this slide is a slide to try and demonstrate how the competence standard is built up. And if we take the top level, level 1, you will see that the UK Spec HRB, and that's what we're referring to it as currently, is the blend between the overarching BSI framework and the UK Spec. And that has come together in this one document, the HRB Contextualized UK Spec document. Below that, on level 2, which are the yellow boxes that you'll see there, this is the discipline-specific annexes. For example, in building services and M&E services, what all professional engineers working within those areas would be expected to demonstrate if they were working on an HRB project. Currently, we have discipline annexes in fire, gas, building, M&E services, and structures, and there will be more. The whole issue around this and the purpose behind having the annexes is to create that future flexibility. The third level and the bottom level shown on the slide, and they're in blue on this particular box, are the very specialist annexes and granular detail of exactly what's contained. So for example, our gas engineers, it would be what all professional gas engineers would be demonstrating at that most granular level in those annexes. And this assumption would be that those annexes are held by the PEI level and perhaps owned at the PEI level in terms of moving them forward rather than the Engineering Council. So a key question, of course, is what might some of the routes to contextualized register be for individuals thinking about this particular activity? So this slide aims to give a little bit of a demonstration of the current thinking and working assumptions that we're currently working forward. But there is a key assumption that underpins the whole basis, and that is any member joining the contextualized register would need to be a member of a PEI and join and then be assessed. So just to take some examples, and on the top left, we have a green person there. And that person is already a registrant and is already a member of the PEI. So if they wish to join the contextualized register for high-rise buildings, they would only be assessed for the new contextualized competencies. If we took a blue person in the middle of the screen there, on the far left, who would be a non-registrant of the Engineering Council, but already a member of a PEI, they would be assessed using the UK Spec HRB. This process is still being developed though, and we're working through the best way of achieving that, but we do have this as a key constraint and direction of moving forward. The red person, who's a non-member and a non-registrant, would need to become a member of a PEI first, and they would also, once a member of a PEI, be assessed using the UK Spec HRB. All applications would still go via a PEI committee for approval. They would then be on the generic and contextualized sections of our registers. Revalidation, which is the underpinning cornerstone of this for contextualized registration, will be subject to, currently the thinking is 5 years. So every 5 years, that HRB revalidation would take place. At any point, though, registrants can opt out of the CON-Reg section, contextualized register section of the register, but still remain on the main register as they currently are or would have been had they been part of that route. So a very flexible future there, trying to encompass the key stages and opportunities for individuals to become members and move through to registration. So another form of contextualized register work that we've encountered and would like to touch on today is the recognized Electrician EdgeTech standard as a national benchmark of competence for electricians. So this allows licensed institutions, if they wish to contextualize our generic standards to meet the needs of their particular technologies or industries which they are concerned with, such as the IET in this particular example of electricians. Once they have completed this work, a professional engineering institution can then publish it as a recognized standard along with ourselves. This was the first such standard with the IET, and it sets out the requirements in a way that is specific to electricians, providing a clear route to professional registration for technicians working in this important area, making it straightforward to understand how their experience will meet the requirements. To date, the IET have registered nearly 100 electricians, EdgeTechs. They've been assessed against the standard and others are in progress. There are some 30 IET volunteers within the electrical discipline supporting this program of work, and that demonstrates just how vital volunteers are to competence and commitment. Whilst the pandemic has prevented in-person workshops, there have been a number of webinars over the last couple of years, and they have been very successful and very well intended. So this IET standard acts as both a national benchmark for electricians, whose expertise is safety critical, but it also demonstrates just how our Engineering Council generic standards can be contextualized for specific roles and sectors. And I'm delighted to see the project and the progress IET have made in this particular area. So hopefully today has highlighted just how achieving, demonstrating and maintaining competence is at the heart of professionalism, and how it will help ensure that society has confidence in the work being carried out by all the PEI members and Engineering Council registrants. Thank you for your time today.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed for that, helping enormously our understanding, particularly of the role of the Engineering Council. Next is our opportunity to move on to some of the issues that you have raised and some of the questions that you have asked. We'll see how many we manage to get through. There's a wide variety, and so if this next session seems a bit chopping and changing and moving around, that's a reflection of the questions rather than the way in which we've structured this. Let me start, if I may, with you, Dame Judith. And the question that's been raised is, the conversation so far has focused on safe housing, but all other buildings need to be equally safe: hospitals, hotels, offices, retail, etc. How would you respond to that? What is your view?
I wouldn't disagree with that at all. Of course, it's clear that we want all buildings to be safe. But I think the scale of the problem and where we're starting from is what we just need to reflect on. I think what we've discovered is that in the domestic sector, particularly residential buildings, standards currently are lower. So there's more improvement needs to be made. But the final outcome, I think I reflected in my presentation, was that we need all buildings to be safe and fit for purpose. I wouldn't argue with that at all.
Thank you very much. Would either Sir Julian or Alistair, do you want to comment?
Safety is paramount in everything that we do. Of course, whatever comes from any of the lessons that we learn on a particular building type has equal applicability across both the private and public sector for everything, in terms of the generic issues that come from it. And fire safety is one of those. So nothing more to add. I mean, of course.
Okay, thanks, Sir Julian. And Alistair, from your experience, what is the key driver for organisations supporting staff with professional registration?
Thank you, Keith, and that's a good question. The key driver, there are a number of drivers actually involved here, and first and foremost, I would say, is the development of staff. After all, we all say in organisations that the staff is the most important resource. So how better to demonstrate that importance than by encouraging staff through professional registration and supporting them. It also can be a great help internally within an organisation in that people can take up a mentoring role, and that mentee-mentor role is really helpful in bridging gaps of perhaps generations, bringing people through. It's really important to create that solidarity within an organisation that professional competence, as demonstrated through registration, is achieved. The selling and marketing of organisations is also really important. After all, they're keen in terms of how they demonstrate their professionalism to clients, but also reassuring the public. And again, staff competence, professional registration can be at the heart of that. And it can be a really good position in positioning your organisation within both the marketplace and generally wider within society. But also one of the areas that I feel personally is quite important is it creates with those that are going through that professional registration and maintaining that process through CPD or looking to achieve it, is it widens their horizon. It also ensures that they look beyond just the company or organisation that they're working with and have experiences and blended discussions with all of the different bodies outside and different companies and different individuals who share the same space that they're particularly working in. So in short, it's a very important, I feel, for organisations. And certainly all those years ago, when I first went on the engineering route, my choice of my first employer was certainly involved in their attitude and support of professional registration.
So Julian?
I agree with what Alistair has said. I also look at the chat line at the bottom of the YouTube, and if I may, I'll just pick up one particular point from Neil Bridgman, who claims, he states, most electricians will see EdgeTech as a route off the tools, not to continue working on them. I think that it's up to us, professional engineering institutions across the board, and indeed to the Engineering Council and powers that be. And Judith has, the ear of many people, as it were, for us to actually show what we need is a higher level of professionalism across all that we do in engineering for our engineers and technicians. It's not a route off the tools. It's not a route into the office place. That's a career choice at some point. This is about showing our professionalism and again, taking the UK spec, as it were, in its widest sense to say, this is the marker, these are the skills I have, this is the qualification I have. I'm undertaking relevant, continued professional development. I'm keeping up with all that actually regulators are doing. I'm maintaining my skills. I am actually doing the proper job that actually is required to deliver exactly what the customer wants to the right safety, to the right standards. And it is not, in my view, a way off the tools, as it were. We truly have to try and change this particular perspective in the United Kingdom and raise the overall status of engineering and, most importantly, our technicians across this country. I think this is why we can often say, and moan a little that people don't understand engineering, don't understand our profession. We don't get the general status that we deserve. And yet here is an opportunity to learn off the back of a horrific tragedy that actually there are better ways to step forward and to actually underpin the professionalism of our people through professional registration. That would be my answer. Could be off the tools, that's a career choice. That does not necessarily, the two do not go together. And I hope that that makes the point, as it were. But Neil, thanks very much indeed. Great point.
Yeah. Thanks to both.
Can I just add to that?
Oh,
Keith,
please
because
do.
I think it's quite important to recognise how much. So the original question was, what is the key driver for people to acquire proof of competence? One of the new drivers in the system, once the new regulatory regime is introduced, will be that not just the regulator, but the responsible persons within the system are going to demand that proof from the people that they take on to do the work. So this will no longer just be about the employer choosing to do it because it's good, he or she thinks it's good for their employees, but they will be required to do it in order to demonstrate to the supply chain, to their customers, to their clients, that they are employing competent people on the job, and to be able to demonstrate that to the regulator too. So I think we should just be clear that whilst all of those other things are still true, there is going to be a new dynamic in the system as well.
So you're arguing there for effectively third-party quality assurance?
No, I'm saying that we're going to switch from a system where in the past the regulation of buildings has been about someone checking that the building complies with prescriptive regulations. And we all know the difficulties of that, particularly with electrotechnical work where it's hidden. If the regulator's not there at the right time, they can't see it, so they have to assume it's been done.
Yeah.
But in the new system, which is less prescriptive, the responsible people within the system will be required to satisfy the regulator that they have confidence that a good job has been done. And one of the ways that they'll do that is by saying, well, I employed competent people and here's the proof.
Sticking with you, Judith. Oh, sorry, go on, Julian.
Well, all I was going to add is that, and thank you to Neil Bridgman for the additional comments. And I fully understand that indeed across the technician workforce, there are a lot of people who are, his term, subbies. And I think we all understand that. And I accept that point entirely, but we have to then be putting the responsibility onto the employers from a corporate perspective, such that in the way that Dame Judith has just said, that indeed as quotes go in for big jobs, for any jobs, that indeed they are going to be done by professional people to a professional standard. And I appreciate that's not an easy thing for us to do, but and that's why horrific tragedies have happened in the past and will continue to until such time as we grab hold of this. And it doesn't necessarily mean additional cost. And that's perhaps the point that comes back to value engineering. It does not mean additional cost. It means actually doing what it is the quote says at the right level with a great level of transparency for everybody to see. Thank you.
And if I could just add to that, one of the most important aspects in terms of this value engineering and this transparency is the whole principle within the engineering framework of working within an ethical framework, and for engineers to display that ethical framework for what they're achieving. So the value engineering and the looking at that aspect is all about.
Hello. We seem to have lost Alistair there.
It's frozen.
Yeah. Could I pass that, what he was beginning to say, across to you, Dame Judith, and the suggestion that value engineering is really just a cost-cutting exercise?
That's what it's become. Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with that. But again, I take Julian's point entirely. We're not looking to shift from the current pretty awful situation to one where everything suddenly goes up in cost. I don't believe it needs to incur extra cost.
Yeah.
What it needs is people to approach what the new regime we're moving into with the right attitude and the right culture. There is nothing wrong with the principle of value engineering when it's applied in the right way.
Yeah. Okay. The point has been raised that do we run the risk of developing a two-tier system? High risk competencies will establish a two-tier high and low risk approach. Should the general approach be exactly the same?
This notion that we may end up with a two-tier system has been aired a number of times since my report, and it is a difficult one. But I am confident that we have in place a mechanism in the form of the bill and so on that will avoid that happening, and we'll do that in a number of ways. The first is to recognise this principle of proportionality. It would be inappropriate, for example, to apply the same regime and the same level of risk assessment requirements to simple structures that we're going to require for complex structures. So you have to have a proportionate system, but it doesn't have to become a two-tier system. And one of the ways in which we will avoid it becoming a two-tier system is that it's very clearly written into the bill that unless the new building safety regulator sees people approaching things in the right way and in a proportionate way throughout the range of buildings to which this applies, there is the means in the bill to extend the regulatory scope to other buildings of other sizes and complexity. So the incentive to do the right thing and do it proportionately is very clearly there and rests with the industry. And if they don't do it, then we'll see more regulation. So there is an incentive to do the right thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Dame Judith. Important points there. Alistair seems to be frozen still. So
he's back with us, I think.
Oh, really? Okay. Are you muted, Alistair? We can't hear you. Are you muted? Okay.
Oh.
Hello? Okay. Let me ask the question anyway, and hopefully you'll be able to come in. It's about CPD generally, and that CPD has just become a buzzword, and now we see CPD for everything. Is there a risk that the intent has been watered down?
I mean, if I may start that question first, as it were, or try and answer to it. It could have been. CPD is not the answer to everything. But I think as we look at technology moving so quickly, never moved as quickly as it is right now, particularly with regard to anything to do with digital, then the reality is for many of us, certainly me, and many others will have had a slug of training right at the beginning of one's career, whether as an apprentice, at college, at university, in professional training, and then one goes out and learns almost everything through experience. The reality is that the regulatory environment in which we live continually it adapts and changes and evolves. The rules under which we're working are completely changing all the time. And technology through digital means that things, we are all behind. I am behind. I'll claim that I am not up to date with technology in the way that I would love to be in all of the fields that I'm interested in. And the only way of doing it is to either keep reading, that happens to be CPD. One doesn't have to undergo a training course, one can just read things. One can perhaps hear a podcast. That's, again, not going to take too much time. If you're updating yourself or you're walking the dog, as it were, with a set of headphones in, it's not going to take a huge amount of time. It is, however, going to provide the opportunity for you to top up your education and knowledge about which you are already an expert. And it just gives you the extra edge to know what's going on. Now, I'm giving a specific example about how easy it potentially can be. What it is, I think, is the responsibility up to the PEIs to ensure that the CPD we offer is of relevance to our members and to those professionally registered. And that's where there are plenty of opportunities for our corporate partners, our enterprise partners, our members, be they be subbies or indeed, very large organizations in the civil engineering sector, to actually contact us and provide, a request as to what it is they actually want. And then we can provide it. Now, clearly, we have a little bit more intelligence. We can actually anticipate what hopefully is going to be that requirement. So I think that it's up to us to actually try and provide something that's relevant. To many of those who are commenting, and I absolutely understand why should you pay to be paid. Paul Skirm, one of my lovely colleagues from Swansea, who again has provided comments to me in many other forums, and I respect his views enormously. The reality is we've got to try and make a difference. We cannot accept things to be how they have always been in the past. I think that's the point that Dame Judith has been saying with regard to the change in legislation. We've got to make a stand and try and change things for the better and prove that we can set standards that people can adhere to and actually do the job that they've been asked to do by their customer to a high standard or to an appropriate standard, and applying value engineering, making sure that you get the function that indeed you need out of the service or the acquisition, the building, the new building, whatever it may be, but at the right cost. And I think that, in terms of long-term, infrastructure, we've got to correct the mistakes of the past, and we've got to try and turn a corner. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be free, but I do think we've got to do something about it. And now is the opportunity under this example, and in particular for those who are qualified as electricians working in the domestic and infrastructure world. It's exactly the same working on aircraft and indeed ships, etc., where the regulations are indeed already there in heavy numbers. We've just got to stretch it out and make sure that we've got the right workforce who are appropriately trained, appropriately experienced, doing the right thing. Easy to say, I appreciate that. But if there's not enough of us who keep saying that now into the future, we will never bring the differences that are needed.
Alistair?
I have a track record, I know. Thank you.
Alistair?
Yeah, well, just to absolutely confirm that those comments there, they really go to the heart of what this is about. It's about making a difference. And I think if we're not, it's not just being seen to do it, it's actually making those steps, being able to demonstrate to others that we're doing it and achieving it in a manner that's going to create confidence and confidence in the wider society and the public. So I think it really goes to the heart of it. And the CPD, it's often demonstrated just how important that is widening the horizons. As I think I mentioned a little earlier on, it's about creating an environment where you can learn from others, you can gain different experiences from people from different organizations, and that includes globally and different experiences in different countries. So it's absolutely vital that we really push this ahead and that we do it with some enthusiasm and gusto, because we need to get to that better place that we're talking about in terms of the requirements behind competence and demonstrating that competence.
We've had a couple of questions come in around the links with the institutions, and that while people broadly agree and understand the notion of recognising CPD through a professional institution, many thousands choose not to go down that route. How do we ensure increasing competence on those who aren't directly linked to a professional institution?
Well, that's a really, really interesting topic. And I think my plea here would be for all of those that are not linked to a professional institution to consider the benefits of actually achieving that. And this is where it goes back to employers' specifications, clients in the briefs requiring that level of professionalism and commitment. And I think it'll be harder as we go forward in the future to convince the public, for example, without some demonstrating some benchmark of that competence. So it's really, I would turn the question a little bit on the head of saying it's about being part of that institution, shaping that future within it. And that's a really valuable thing to be taking forward. But also, if you're doing that, you can play a part in helping the next generation come through, creating that mentoring environment, but also recognizing that where we've had some of these terrible disasters, as an engineering community, we're taking steps to improve the professionalization and competence.
So Julian, would you add to that, or?
Well, I think that, you know, we can
Are
wait for it. We can.
Are we in violent
massive
agreement here?
Sorry, we are in violent agreement. I think I mean, I started off the point and Alistair kind of agreed with me, and I just reinforced what he says. Now, the reality is, to how do we do this? Do we sit back and wait for legislation to do this all? That's one way, but indeed we've been waiting for that for a long time. If you just come back to CPD, I think what we've got to try and do is make it more easily accessible and certainly make it relevant. And I think there's a bit of a push and a pull. So indeed, we could push through waiting for legislation and saying no one can actually work for anybody until indeed they are professionally registered. And we've got a long way to wait for that, or we're going to need a massive input from the government, as it were. And that's one way. Or we actually start offering something that's more accessible, more relevant for all of the members, and most importantly, their colleagues, those who potentially aren't members, and certainly try and make some of it available free. Let's just say, let's just get the thing going, as it were. And then, actually then, in exactly in the way that Alistair described, and I think most professional engineers and technicians would then say, is actually then try and actually sell the proper membership benefits, as it were, that one can get. And indeed, it could be at a higher level of CPD. Again, the other benefits that come from it, you know, it's not going to be one thing that makes a difference. There's not going to be one silver bullet. It's got to be a number of activities that are coordinated across our industry to make that difference. And all of us have actually got to take a little bit of risk, as it were, to let it happen and to make it happen. And we can do so if we collaborate and try and, again, certainly would look thereafter to corporate partners, to corporate industry, to start to take, you know, the majority of the responsibility for ensuring the right standards are applied for the work that they undertake and contract for and get well paid for. Don't everybody join in?
Yeah. Dame Judith, how can we ensure this without legislation? Part of your report was about, and I paraphrase, the tendency not to do anything unless it's a legal requirement. I exaggerate, I understand that. Does that mean that we need to introduce legislation for electricians? I mean, dare I mention the phrase license to practice, as with gas safe?
Okay, a number of questions there. Where I'd like to start on that, Keith, is by just reminding you that of something you said in your introduction, which is that I chaired the Health and Safety Executive for 10 years. And during that time, I came across people, employers, companies on the whole, across that whole spectrum. Some who only ever did health and safety because the law required them to do it. The ones who do it best are those who do it because they believe it's the right thing to do. And that will be the case whatever legislation you put in place in any domain, that there are some who will only do it because they're required to, and because the level of penalty that they will incur if they don't do it is high enough that it provides that that barrier. So I think we have to recognize that in any system, we're going to work with a range of people in different places on that spectrum. What I see is a number of different measures going into place at the same time now, as a result of my review, some of which are about people stepping up and doing the right thing, And I think the institutions are to be congratulated on the way in which they've responded to this whole issue of competence. And what I think is going to happen once the legislation hits the deck next year is that we're suddenly going to see a shift in the market where people who will commission work will look for that level of competence. And all of a sudden, if we haven't anticipated that, if we haven't made the most of the opportunity, what we're likely to see is the building of new buildings or the remediation of existing buildings slowing down because people can't get access to people with the right qualifications. And that would be a really poor outcome, which is why I'm very keen to see people get ahead of the legislation and get their qualifications, because the market is going to shift.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, all of you, for the exchanges here, which have been interesting and illuminating. 2 or 3 controversial issues there, but much that broad agreement that we're getting from people who are on the chat line. So can I thank all 3 of you very much indeed for your frankness and your input. We're going to move on now to the next section of the agenda, which is a discussion panel about keeping people safe in buildings. This is going to be chaired and run by my colleague Graham Kenyon, and now I would like to hand over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to chair this discussion panel on keeping people safe in buildings. I'm Graham Kenyon. I chair the IET's Wiring Regulations Policy Committee and also one of the technical committees for JPEL 64, which looks after BS 7671, requirements for electrical installations, our wiring regulations here in the UK. And I'm joined here with Charlie Pugsley and Chris Norris. Charlie, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Graham. My name's Charlie Pugsley. I'm the Deputy Assistant Commissioner with the London Fire Brigade, working in fire safety. I also represent the National Fire Chiefs Council on matters of electrical safety.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. And Chris, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Graham. I'm Chris Norris. I'm the Director of Policy with the National Residential Landlords Association. We, as the name would suggest, are a national body for private residential landlords. We offer support and guidance. What it probably means today is I'm the least qualified person to talk about any of these issues, because we represent our members across a whole gamut of different matters that affect them as private landlords. But of course, they are duty holders when it comes to safety.
Well, absolutely. And of course, as a user of competent persons and effectively an employer, how would landlords, including those with large property portfolios, ensure electricians they use have their individual competence assessed as opposed to organisational competence?
With some difficulty, to be entirely honest, and I'm not sure there's one kind of strict rule book that most landlords would follow. I mean, one thing, and I would say this coming from the organisation that I come from, is we have a recognised supplier programme. So we try to do a little bit of that vetting for landlords so they can come to our website, nrla.org.uk, and look up services. The difficulty, I suppose, when it comes to electricians, to competent people, is they tend to have their patch. And it's very difficult for us as a national body to have a comprehensive enough list of suppliers, of companies, of service providers, of competent people to be able to help them wherever they are in the country. So that provides a few difficulties. I think what we tend to do most of the time, because it's the easiest way, is to signpost landlords towards the Competent Person Register or towards any of the various kind of affiliation accreditation bodies that exist in this industry, in this marketplace. But equally, we have a lot of landlords, particularly some of those larger businesses who want to develop relationships with particular tradespeople, and they'd look for a few different criteria, I suppose. So they'd look for the usual things. They'd look for adequate insurance. They'd look to check that those individuals were you know, in respect to the kind of work that landlords tend to have carried out, they'd look to see that they were qualified to the 18th edition. They'd also look to see that they were qualified to carry out inspection and testing, because that's one of the most frequent things that we'd look for. And then also you'd look for experience. Ideally, you'll find someone on personal and professional recommendation from the likes of our organisation or networking events, but it doesn't always happen that way. So looking up online, looking up at the Competent Person Register, I think is probably the way that most will do it.
No, thank you, Chris. And Charlie, I mean, is there a struggle to recruit fire safety professionals, and do you feel that those fire safety professionals are adequately supported by other professionals who may affect the fire safety design of the building?
So I'm glad you've gone straight in with a very difficult question there, Graham, because it is multifaceted. So there is definitely a shortage of competent professionals in the fire safety space in terms of building safety. And I think competency, be it with electrical safety, fire safety, it does remain a challenge. So from that perspective, part of it, I think, as Chris alluded to, was about the blend of qualification and experience. And certainly in the fire safety space, just to get up to, if you like, a basic level, you're looking at 18 months. And for a sort of a more slightly higher level of competency, it's round about 3 years. As for an engineer level, I think, I'm sure you know, through the IET, this can be 5, 6, 7 years plus. And of course, what actually exacerbates the problems is that if you get circumstances such as new regulations that have requirements or changes that come into force, then it's whether or not the market in terms of competent people who can fulfill that is actually big enough to support the need. And then you then get a situation whereby it then drives a market where people are moving around a lot more frequently. And while we're doing our very best to bring new and train people up, upskill them, give them the experience, I think it is a real challenge. And then, of course, for the end user, which comes back to yours and Chris's point, it's just that bit about how do you actually feel sure that you've got the right person beyond doing the basic checks that Chris has already outlined.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. Do you mind if I directly ask how fire services are helping to address this problem?
Well, I think I can speak while I have an awareness of the national picture. I think what you've got to look at is, for example, London as a region has got over half the high-rise risk out of the whole country. So the market forces and the demand in London will be slightly different to perhaps a more rural area. Obviously, that area is no less important, but just in terms of supply and demand. What we are doing, though, certainly in London, is we've recognised that we, particularly as a public service, unfortunately, we can't start handing out £250,000 salaries to all and sundry just because the demand's there. So what we have to do is be slightly more pragmatic. So we've actually created an academy to bring people through. So in effect, they have a level 3 and a level 4 nationally aligned qualification to work through. And alongside the academic side, we then give them practical experience and training, go out, do inspections with them, etc. But as I say, it is a long process. So I think we currently have around 50 odd people going through that at various stages at the moment, because there is a really big job ahead of us, particularly with the introduction of the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Bill. No,
thank you, Charlie. That's really insightful. Chris, if you mind, if I ask you a long-standing question in the construction industry is quality versus cost. How do landlords manage that with their properties?
Oh, that is an interesting question. And I think the perception of private landlords is they always look for the lowest cost. And, you know, that has its knock on to the perception of the quality that exists in our marketplace. I think in reality, that's not true. I mean, we've got a diaspora of different private landlords. There are, well, actually, pick your estimate. There's something like 2 million private landlords in the UK, and they've all got a slightly different approach to their business. But I think what most will do is they'll look for value for money, and they'll look at the needs of their particular consumer, their particular market, When it comes to the finish, not necessarily the standards and the quality, of course, when it comes to standards and safety, we'll always want to find the best way to achieve the safest outcome that we can, because A, it's ethically the right thing to do, and B, we are legally responsible for the safety of those properties and those properties that become people's homes. So you'd always want people to go out there and find a high quality product where they can. I think one of the difficulties we often see actually is where there's a conflict or a contradiction between, say, a period property and fire safety regulations, for instance. And Charlie will be familiar with this. We get a lot of calls about fire doors, for instance. What rating fire door you need, and does a landlord need to remove solid oak Victorian doors to fit a modern 30-minute, 60-minute, whatever it might be, door. So we have trade-offs, I think, that are made there, and all we can really do is try to impart in our members, a basic level of understanding about fire risk, make sure they're doing those kind of risk assessments and those kind of assessments where there are other elements of safety, but just try to get in their minds an understanding of what they need to do to meet their obligations, but also the different ways that they might be able to do that to get a good return, but also not to detract from the qualities, the style, the aesthetics of a building that they might have purchased.
No, thank you. And how does the National Residential Landlords Association support landlords in this process of selecting the right contractors and the right quality versus cost and maintainability, which of course is another aspect, isn't it? The maintainability.
It absolutely is. I mean, maintenance is a huge aspect of what landlords do on a day-to-day basis, and interacting with their tenants, the people who call these properties home. Excuse me, who call these properties home. I think we do a couple of different things. So first of all, we try to take some of the legwork, some of the decision making out of the process by approaching suppliers, tradespeople, various companies that target their services of private landlords, do some due diligence, do some vetting, try to ascertain the quality of their work. And whilst we normally stop short of necessarily recommending services, we recognise these services and we demonstrate that they've met a certain threshold for quality. So we'll do that. But as I mentioned earlier, being a national body, and a lot of the time these services, these tradespeople work very locally, it's quite difficult to have that whole panel. So I think probably the more important or the more comprehensively supportive thing that we do is we offer training to our members. So we don't expect our members to be qualified electricians or qualified experts in building safety, but we expect them to be able to ask the right questions. And we do that by entering into basic competence training, really. And I've got to be careful with that word because I know it means different things in different sectors, but to try and make them competent to contract with people and to ask the right questions about their experience and their qualification. And I think if we've done that, actually we can overcome a lot of the hurdles that landlords as consumers, frankly, might face.
So I mean, that's an important consideration, isn't it? The client and the client's duties, the competence to perform those is equally important to the contractor's duties, and everybody's got to work together to make sure that the assets that we're refurbishing, maintaining and building are correct, safe and not only habitable, but have the relevant fire safety and other safety elements built in.
Absolutely right. And I think the added complication sometimes with rented property is the factor that the person living in that property isn't the owner, isn't necessarily the duty holder. And whilst it's very rare that a tenant would go out of their way to decrease the safety of their property, they won't always report things that are very important back to landlords. If you have fire doors that aren't closing properly anymore, for instance, that's something that's very important to report back so that we can effect repairs. The age-old cliche of taking the batteries out of the smoke alarm, thankfully not such a big thing now with hardwired and interlinked devices, but those kind of things, not reporting if something isn't working, not reporting a concern. And from our point of view, the amount of times we have a landlord call us and say, I couldn't believe the state of the light switches when I went to inspect a property. And that tenant perhaps was concerned that the landlord might be angry, that something had be damaged, but actually, we're far more dissatisfied if there's something unsafe in that property that could cause serious injury to the tenant and serious damage to the assets of the property.
No, absolutely. And one thing that's sort of at the forefront of my mind is that as we move forward, particularly in refurbishment and new build, we're being asked to be ever more energy conscious, and there will be perhaps an increased reliance upon electricity as other forms of energy become deprecated for energy efficiency and the good of the environment and the planet. Some of those things include things like electric vehicle charging, battery storage, perhaps the use of heat pumps for heating. And those things are not only going to increase electrical load, but perhaps battery storage, so that solar PV energy can be stored during the day when people aren't at home and reused later when they are at home, are going to bring in some new facets for safety, and perhaps some new skill sets required, because some of these systems require control, both to perform their function but also to maintain safety. This technology, of course, is moving on at quite a fast pace, and one of the things that I have been helping the industry with is to see how these things can be done safely. But also, in the back of my mind, is the question of how can we ensure the competence of professionals whilst keeping people safe in the home and workplace. Charlie, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's something that does keep me up at night sometimes, so to speak. And I think it comes up, I'm going to start off just by revisiting one of Chris's points, where he talked about perhaps older buildings, heritage type buildings. And I think that's where the experience of the person can really come to the fore, because it's sometimes around finding solutions to make it fit for the building and for the tenants. And then when we look at that and we map that across to new technologies, I think it's the same thing. It's another skill set or area of experience that people need to acquire. So, for example, you talk about energy storage. I think that is clearly, we support things that are going to make the environment better, less carbon emissions, etc. But we do have concern, I think, just touching on the point you made about that there are times where we feel that innovation is a risk of being ahead of our knowledge base, and particularly when you've got emerging markets. It's so, without naming brands, you could get, say, a large car manufacturer that's gone into home energy storage where everything is perhaps to a very highly tested standard. But then the more rapidly that market evolves and you get worldwide competition and products, the more you're going to see variables. So I think it is a real concern in how do we not get in the way of innovation or choice or value, but how do we ensure the message about safety is really key? Particularly when you think about the global market for just things that are made up of smaller battery cells. We know from our own experience in London Fire Brigade that there's been a whole raft on everything from hoverboards to small energy storage units, where the units have either been non-compliant or counterfeit. So again, it's where all stakeholders beyond the sector of landlords, people managing properties, the electrical and the fire sector, it's also about regulation, borders, trading standards, because we all have a part to play. And then, of course, importantly, the consumer, because with many people buying products via online marketplaces rather than from the actual manufacturer or retailer, that creates a new dynamic and a new challenge to us to face. So there's a, perhaps I'm guilty of rambling slightly there, Graham, I do apologise, but it is like a very complex Venn diagram where all these different areas overlap, and it's how we unpick that collectively to try and ensure that safety is considered.
No, absolutely. And one of the things that's at the forefront of my mind, particularly with batteries, is where they're located is very important. The amount of energy that's stored is extremely important. And if there is anything in their housing location or even fire detection and alarm within the premises that's required to facilitate that operating safely and also being safe to manage if anything does go wrong. And I guess a challenge is that there are many different kinds of building construction techniques different building fabrics that have been used in the UK. And that just adds to the complexity and adds to the difficulties of both fire risk assessors and installers in answering some of these questions, I guess. And I guess you've been thinking about that, Charlie, in the background as well, and and how responders might deal with those different situations as well.
Oh, very much, Graham. And this is a worldwide challenge amongst the fire community. We've heard of everything from bringing, if you like, a roll-in, roll-off skip that you fill with water and submerge a vehicle into, to things like fixed installations, how we just stand back and just try and cover the surrounding risk. And that's before we start thinking about user interaction or what the consumer does with the product. But as I'm sure you know from your own experience, if you're putting, say, a small transformer or substation in a building, it's very clear about what you need to do in terms of the fabric of the building and how that then scales down for the electrical installation. In terms of with these new systems, again, because it is, well, sort of emerging all different sizes and different solutions, and there's a bigger demand for affordable housing, it might be a case of very shortly we're going to see large battery energy storage systems in communal spaces, because I think, using your example, it harnesses the solar array on the roofing or on the sides of the building, and then it has to store that because it's for not just one occupancy, it's for multiple. So it really is about how we work on that together. And I think that's why sessions like this are really important as well, because it is that end-to-end engagement. So we're all trying to be minded of the issues and trying to help unpick them, hopefully.
No, thank you very much. And colleagues, thank you for that introduction.
Thank you very much, all of you, for that. There's some very interesting points coming out there, which no doubt will be picked up in the Q&A. We're moving now to a short video by one of our fellows, Ryan Dempsey, who will share his views on recognising a diverse and capable workforce. Following that, we'll be going back to Graham and the panel to deal with the Q&A. Thank you.
I believe we're simplifying people's obligations to make a more diverse workforce. And what I mean by diverse workforce is we are putting 10 electricians in a room, and 9 of those electricians will be fully qualified. And by fully qualified, I mean they've gone out of their way to get more of these short courses. And it's not a short course as we criticize in the industry. A short course is a level 3 qualification in testing and inspection, a level 4 qualification in system design. And 9 of those electricians will have all of those qualifications, but the employer will only be wanting an electrician who can work on a solar PV or a 4 kilowatt solar PV system. And that one electrician, and I'm using the term loosely, so an electrician is somebody who works on wiring. That electrician who's done 3 or 4 years working on a solar PV system is going to charge less than the electricians, the other 9 electricians who are qualified to do everything. And that's the issue with regards to legislation and the understanding of the electrical title is, yes, if you pay a little bit more for the fully qualified, if something goes wrong, that person is capable of fixing that. That person is capable of understanding why it's gone wrong and how to fix it. Whereas the person who's worked on solar PV for the last 4 years or 3 years gets the job, and all of a sudden gets the job as an electrician, is then asked to do something else, and to save face they say yes and they try, and that's where the problems come. That's where things become that's where the problems arise, I think.
So now let's take some of the questions that have been raised in the live stream. First of all, for Chris, should private landlords who self-assess hold liability for work, or like a private residence owner, is a liability on the contractor? And perhaps should all landlords hold property as a limited company? Chris, what's your view on that?
Oh, some very different questions there. I mean, I think in terms of liability insurance, I think all landlords should be holding liability insurance. I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't be. And in fact, if you're seeking a good, comprehensive landlord-specific insurance policy, it should include a degree of that. I know the policies that we offer through partners at the NRLA, I think, offer £2 or £5 million liability as standard. So I'd expect that to be there if you're doing any kind of assessment, and if you're commissioning your own works. So I don't think there's anything to debate there. In terms of limited company ownership, it would certainly be a big shake-up to our sector. There's probably about 15 to 20% of stock in the private rented sector owned in some form of vehicle, so enveloped in some way into a limited company or a limited partnership. The overwhelming majority are owned by individuals, but I wouldn't have thought that should affect that should be impacted too much by their liability, as long as they are insuring themselves properly. And actually what's crucial, which we've heard about various trades all the way through today, is that those landlords are doing relevant qualifications and staying up to date with CPD. And if they're doing that and they're insuring themselves properly, actually they're mitigating their risks as much as they can.
That's very interesting points there, Chris. And really straight into a question then, beautifully on CPD itself, and asking, are there two levels of CPD? CPD approved for competence relevance to somebody's job, and CPD for people's own development and interest. So, Charlie, what do you think about that?
I think both are equally as relevant, and it's important to try and always have a broader view. In terms of in the fire sector, the Institute of Fire Engineers, if you're in a role where you have to record your CPD, which is pretty much across the sector now, you'll be expected to have a mix of informal and formal CPD. So you get events such as the IET put on that may have accreditation, and then you might have others where it could be self-reading, guided learning, etc. But I do think that there's a blend of both.
Oh, thank you, Charlie. I mean, from my point of view, engineering is a sector in which we're often pushing boundaries. We are doing jobs for the first time. Sometimes we come across problems that we haven't seen before, and we need to know how to deal with those. And so from my point of view, general interest can be at least as important as core competence. But I do take the point, I think, that the question tries to make, is that core competence is of paramount importance. Having the relevant knowledge and experience to do a job, knowing your limitations, are perhaps the most important things for people in engineering and the electrotechnical sector as a whole. Chris, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the landlording sector, so much as we are a sector, is very different to engineering, and there aren't the same requirements, so to speak. But we actually run a very similarly structured form of CPD. Actually, we talk about structured and unstructured CPD, which would be, I think, the same as your formal and informal, or assessed and unassessed. So we'd encourage all landlords to undertake what we call a basic foundation of learning, which provides an accredited level, a badge, so to speak, for landlords. And then there's a whole host of other areas that I don't think will ever get caught up into the equivalent of a core competency, which might be through a local authority licensing scheme, for instance, for a landlord, but actually is incredibly important for running, a high quality, efficient business, and actually just for being able to identify opportunities in that lettings business. So I know that a lot of our members will obtain their core qualification of accredited landlord status because it's required by a local authority, for instance, if they need a license. But they'll go on and they'll undertake education courses from us on marketing a property or on risk assessment, for instance. We'll take people through how to undertake a Legionella risk assessment or a fire risk assessment, or managing those risks in an HMO, for instance. And they're things that maybe aren't central to their business, but they are undertaken because of interest, and they're undertaken because of some of the softer learning activities that we encourage our members through. So reading our magazine, for instance, will counter towards 1 or 2 CPD points every quarter, but it'll actually pique their interest to go on and do something else.
It's really interesting, and there's a couple of questions actually that have come up that sort of directly link into this. So the first one is, how can any professional specify competence for electrical work? is there any yellow pages or Facebook? And another one states electrical competency is too complicated for landlords to be able to delve into it too deeply, and homeowners and so on. So how could the IET make this more comprehensible and understandable for people so that they can actually employ the right people to do the job? Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the latter point there is a really important one. I think it can be too complex for a landlord, a layperson, particularly if you think about our private rented sector, and that I think something like 85% of landlords own fewer than 5 properties. These aren't people who are running property businesses full time, who have the time and the capacity to learn a great deal about their obligations. So I mean, for us, we would always signpost people towards the competent person scheme online, for instance, the register, to look them up there, or towards one of the affiliation bodies. So NAPIT or Alexa or NIC, EIC, there may be others. I always get the initialisms wrong, I've got to be honest, but towards a recognised body that might be able to help explain that. Because if you do look at the code of practice, the guidance that exists around electrical installation checks, you know, it is difficult for a landlord to be able to identify whether those people are, whether the people that they may be approaching are appropriately insured, are qualified in not only in the wiring regs, but in inspection itself, and have the right kind of experience. Because frankly, there's very little worse than finding someone who shows you a qualification, but actually has never done one of those checks before. So I think we'd always signpost people towards the online register or the affiliation bodies, and that takes that away, that decision making away from the landlord to a certain extent, and allows them to hopefully trust that the people on those registers are competent to do the work.
No, thank you. And Charlie, I mean, related to that, of course, we've got, as we mentioned in our discussion earlier, there are a lot of new technologies coming out, and with potentially, you know, additional learning and competence requirements to install those and make sure that they're safe. Are employers taking the necessary steps to ensure they're working within fire safety best practice and also achieving some of these new competence requirements?
I think that's a really interesting question in terms of, should I say interesting or challenging? I'm not sure, because loading bullets, because when you think about it, it's something that cuts across the fire, the electrical and building sectors in terms of building regs, etc. So it does provide a real challenge. So if we look at things like solar arrays and battery energy storage systems in a domestic market, there are several things there that come into play. And we also have in the battery energy storage systems and similar markets to that, I think it's been said several times that innovation is running ahead of standards, because when you look at how long it takes to develop a British standard compared to a PAS or a code of practice, for example, clearly it takes time to gather the expertise and put that together. But the change is that even myself as a bit of a layperson in elements of the electrical sector, it's just moving so quickly. So I think this is where the IET has got a real role to play in terms of that leadership in just trying to help people navigate their way through, because unfortunately I don't have a straight answer, Graham, but I do think you do highlight something that involves, you know, be it the NRLA, ourselves, the IET, the people actually undertaking the work. We all need to come together, because what we don't need is a disaster or something going wrong, which really does cause lots of issues for those affected by it, and a real vacuum in terms of be it regulation or guidance around it. So I think we all have a part to play.
Oh, thank you. It is really interesting. And something else you mentioned, Charlie, is that you have an academy for people to follow. How vital do you believe it is to have on-the-job training alongside academic qualifications? And can we be assured the same route is being followed across the country? Or is this just exclusively in London? Well,
first of all, I'm just going to come back to a point you made earlier about informal peer learning, because if you look at something, people who work in the domestic market, you might know how to test and you might know, if you like, the basics of the wiring regulations, but there are so many different types of building stock that the tradesperson has to work with. This is where peer learning, reading up and stuff is really vital. But coming back to us in terms of our training and the academy, that was post-Grenfell. It's really driven the market in terms of the demand market rate for such fire safety competent professionals. So we basically, unless we're paying rock star wages, sadly we can't bring people in as a public sector on sort of large, huge salaries. And there's just not enough people out there anyway. So what we've done is we're training people with the right traits, abilities to actually, and technical mind, so to speak, to do this. But it's a 1.5 to 3 year pathway. So I think you mentioned apprenticeships earlier on. It's a similar kind of thing where we're mixing a level 3 and a level 4 qualification with in the workplace learning and actually getting out there with competent people to actually learn their trade. But because London is such a different scale to the rest of the country, I think that we've had to take a different route, because rather than in perhaps a small rural brigade with a few officers, 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 officers, we have currently over 100 going around London at the moment, and we're trying to bring on about another 30 or 40 people.
No, thank you. Another interesting question that I often ponder on myself has been raised is, do we feel that there are differences in the competencies of those working for large companies versus small companies, where perhaps the cost of training and further development could be a challenge? And I think the first thing I'd say, looking at that question, is sometimes I guess it's as much of a challenge for large companies to make sure that the information that is required, the competencies and training necessary, is actually distilled right down to the people to everybody that needs it. And sometimes the processes, procedures and mechanisms within the management systems of organizations come into play there. But I suppose, rephrasing that question, is there a huge cost to bear for SMEs and self-employed people in developing and maintaining competence? Chris, what does your organisation think about that?
Well, I think it's my turn to say I've probably not got a straight answer on that one. It stands to reason that if you're a sole trader or you're a small organisation, and when you've got a fast evolving trade or sector, it's going to be costly and it's going to be difficult to keep up to date, and it's vital that you do keep up to date. So I suppose there is a challenge there, but then equally I suppose it's relatively clear cut for you to understand what training you have undertaken, where your skill gaps might be, and what your competency is. I suppose if you look then, or you try and translate that to a larger company, yes, you may have greater resource and you may have more capacity, and you might actually have the ability to cascade that training down and share the load of that training in that CPD. But equally, you've got the challenge of audit and record keeping and finding a way to demonstrate that you've got the right people in the right positions. So I suppose there's no particular sweet spot from the kind of consumer or the end user's point of view, the landlord. We tend to work, or certainly our members kind of relate to us, that they work in 2 particular ways. They either have a brand that they trust. Perhaps they trust the likes of a British Gas because they think there's a standard there and there's a public perception. Or at the other end of the spectrum, they have individuals that they've really got to know well, and that they trust that they A, know what they're doing, but B, would also tell them when they weren't appropriate for a particular job. So I suppose you've got those two extremes. The more that I think out loud, the more sympathy I suppose I have for the middle ground, maybe the medium-sized enterprises that don't have the scale to have a recognized brand and therefore that kind of industry-wide trust, but equally don't necessarily have the capacity to undertake everything they need to all of the time to stay up to date. So, roundabout answer is saying I don't really know, I suppose. But that's where a landlord would come to it from.
Absolutely. Charlie, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think if you're a very large enterprise, you might have an ISO accreditation of the quality management framework, for example. but people are people. And coming back to Chris's comments, in terms of the fire engineering world, I'm aware of very small businesses with just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 fire engineers, but who are exceptionally on the ball when it comes to their competence and their recognition of the importance. So I think it is, you know, I agree with everything that's been said about signposting to those recognised benchmarks or assurances of competency. But I do think you can get perhaps less conscientious people in big firms just as much as you can have very proactive people in small firms. So maybe not quite such a long version, but a similar one to say, I can't say for sure. But again, I just think if you actually make it the norm that people expect CPD competency in the broader sense and people trying to maintain that professionalism, that's the best that we can do.
No, thank you. Keith, did you have anything to add on that particular very important point about sort of size of organisation dynamics and how things are done versus competency of people on the ground?
Well, can I just say that I don't know either. On the other hand, it's a bit horses for courses, because you will have some smaller companies where they expect to be able to do a wide range of things, in which case you need a wide range of expertise. And you may have some larger companies which deploy people in specific areas who will require detailed CPD in that area, but perhaps only a different level elsewhere. It's a tricky one to deal with, and we need to find some way of recognizing both circumstances and acknowledging achievements that individuals have made.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And it's been mentioned, of course, a couple of times through our discussions that we have got some fast-moving technology, and there's a sort of spotlight on electric vehicles and battery storage at the moment. However, from my point of view, we have actually been working on installation safety requirements for these technologies since they were seen to be up and coming, maybe for between 5 and 10 years. It's going to be some time before I think some of those technologies make their way into apprenticeships. Charlie, what impact do you think that's going to have?
Well, we're seeing it now in terms of we've got new fire safety professionals coming through. We're just starting to have people touch base about, be it large or medium scale energy storage systems as just one example. And certainly in the fire sector, I think that we are still very much seeking out research and learning around these pieces. And there's also, in terms of legislation or guidance changes, such as the requirement to install electric vehicle charging points in larger blocks of flats or certain property types. So again, I think it is a challenge, and it's as I touched on earlier, it's a very dynamic sector because of the decarbonisation agenda and everything else. So again, I think you can't just stay in your silo, if you like. You have to be looking outside of that to sort of see what else is going on, because it's areas impact on each other, and we have to think more holistically. And Dame Judith Hacket, who I know was speaking earlier, if you look at some of the findings in her report, it's not just in a single avenue, it cuts across different areas.
Absolutely, thank you. And Chris, what are you looking for from the industry in future with respect to these new technologies? I mean, I guess you're going to be having requirements to install these from now, or maybe past couple of years. What do you see needs doing there?
Oh, I'd like someone to come along and explain them to us and to our members, to be honest, because I think there's a huge lag in terms of understanding from the householder point of view, but also from the kind of property investor point of view. But you're right, we've had a few years now of what we call MEES, which is our minimum energy efficiency standards. Now that's focused mostly up until now on things like loft insulation or cavity wall insulation and relatively minor works that haven't had a huge technological kind of jump. But we are now looking at things like solar PV, and I'm sure in a few years' time, as Charlie mentions, we'll be looking at relatively broad applications for energy storage. And it's something I think that the private rented sector tends to lag behind a little bit, if you excuse the pun of lagging, but mainly because there is this split incentive whereby the householder reaps the benefits and the landlord is paying for the installations. But there's so little understanding about what some of the risks and what we should be looking for in terms of best practice that we really, I suppose we do need someone in the industry to take a lead. A good example at the moment is we as an organisation are encouraging our members where it's appropriate to install EV charging while there's government incentive there. The difficulty is we're in a good place to signpost towards the funding. Actually, we're not particularly well placed to signpost towards best practice when it comes to installation, or what you should be asking for when you look for a tradesman to fit those. So I think we do need some kind of guidance around what does good look like, and what are the red flags.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for those valuable insights into your organisation's thinking. I think it's time for me now to hand back to Keith. Keith, thank you very much.
Graham, thank you very much for that. Indeed, thank you to all your panel, Charlie and Chris. Another wide-ranging discussion with a number of significant issues arising. And that's the sort of thing that makes this interesting. We've had good questions coming up on the chat, and that helps make sure that we're talking about the things that that you want us to talk about. I think it's important to understand that the IET will continue to champion the culture change for individuals. Dame Judith's work, which we've heard about in some detail this afternoon, becomes fundamental to where the whole thing is going, and at the bottom of this, public safety is absolutely key. I think it's important that I think it was Sir Julian said there is no silver bullet to this issue, and that it's important that all organisations who are involved or engaged in this and have this concern with this culture change get together to try and move the whole thing forward. And to that end, if any of you are interested in working with the IT to deliver this, contact us through the email address which you have on your papers, or indeed on the website. To sum up for today, I think this afternoon has been absolutely fascinating. The broad range that we covered in the early part of the afternoon, narrowing down perhaps a bit in the second part of the afternoon, has been illuminating and very, very interesting. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is only the first part of this overall conference, and the second part will move on on the 21st of February. On the 21st, it's in the morning from 10 to 12:30, but please take the opportunity to register for that. Could I just mention that we'll be sending out a survey after this session, and we'd be really grateful if you could take a short while to complete that so that we understand and appreciate your views, and it's not too late to modify the second part of the conference if we have a real issue bearing. I think let me thank not only the speakers, but thank also the audience, and thank you for attending. Thank you particularly for the comments and questions on the chat line, which offline we will be reviewing. So nothing in there is lost. which I think is an important point to make. The whole of this afternoon's activity, the presentation and the panel sessions will be available online in due course. So those of you who either were unable to join right from the beginning or indeed had to leave early for one reason or another will be able to catch up. And feel free to pass this information on to friends and colleagues. So in closing, could I just say thank you very much for your attendance. We look forward to seeing you again on the 21st. Well, were we face to face, I'd say have a good journey home, but I guess most of you are at home already. So thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon.
so salty. I'll still take a bite.
Okay, you can take my Lambo. I'll put on a tight show. You sure you can handle? We be faster than Django.
Gonna take you on a ride. We're gonna burn through the night. When you're so salty, I'll still take a bite.
We can take my Lambo. I'll put on a tight show. You sure you can handle? We be faster than Django.
Can't stop, won't stop. I can't stop, won't stop. I can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop.
Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop, won't stop. Can't stop. Okay.
Gonna take you on a ride. We're gonna burn through the night. When you're so salty.